Hi, it's Andrew and welcome to another edition of the Performance Intelligence Podcast, the podcast about all things human performance. Optimize performance through adapting your physical, psychological, and emotional state. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Professor Adam Nicholls, a leading figure in sports and exercise psychology, who brings a wealth of experience from both academic research and real-world application. As a professor at the University of Hull, Adam has dedicated his career to understanding the psychological aspects of athletic performance. He sits on the editorial board for the International Journal of Sports Psychology. He has published over 95 journal articles and authored 5 books. I don't think this guy sleeps, including my go-to sports psychology Bible, Psychology in Sports Action, now in its 3rd edition. You'll see it's got dog ears and tatters and post-it notes. I go to this a lot. In this episode, my goal is to dive into the fascinating science and practicality of using imagery to enhance performance. This is something I'm doing a lot, both in my practice in sport, also the work I do in military defence and with a number of CEOs and leaders as well. I really want to tease out from your research mental imagery, how it can be used across multiple domains. But beyond your academic achievements, Adam also competes in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, chosen a tough one, and he uses the psychological principles that he teaches in these high-stakes scenarios. Adam lives in York with his partner Kim and their 2 busy boys, Lawson and Sebastian. Professor Adam Nicholls, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to, come on podcast, and having looked at some of your podcast episodes, honoured to be invited. Yeah, it's great to speak to you.
Well, I felt a little bit nervous / excited talking to you today. I said this before we went on, I consume more of your content on LinkedIn than probably 10 other people combined. You're a prolific producer of content, and it's rigorous. It's got science and there's real structure, but it's practical. So let's start there. I'll go off my script I was going to follow. What is it that drives you to produce so much content?
There's a number of things. I just want to touch on the practical thing. So first and foremost, this goes back to in 2006, how you say it, 2006, whatever it is. I was working with an academy rugby union side. So I gave my talk on stress and coping. And at the end of the session, the coach was like, all right then, but what can my players do? And I was like, I've stood up here for like 30 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever it was, trying to explain what they should do. And I'm like, but if the coaches and the players have not come away with a clear recommendation of what they could do, I failed in my talk. So that very, very brief question has kind of lived with me ever since, when working with athletes, when being a leader at work, any communication we have with people, and even into my LinkedIn post, about making sure that I try and explain the practical information of what I'm giving that people can use. And if they can't, then I've failed. So why am I motivated to do it? It's something that I really, really enjoy doing. I think there's a lot of information out there in journal articles which people just don't have access to. And I think sometimes, and I'm, when writing in academic journals, we have to write in a certain way, but it's not really conducive to practitioners being able to kind of get the benefits from that. So it
can look like almost another language. And I remember when I studied psychology, I did coaching psychology, and I got chipped massively in my first assignment because I was writing someone was writing for a newspaper, which I was, and doing a bit of TV work. And I actually got told by one of the lecturers, less jazz hands, more links, back to structure. So it's interesting, isn't it? The world you come from really shapes how you show up in other worlds. But it's really interesting hearing you talk about that. So you got beaten up in your feedback because you'd been so strong as an academic. You'd flex that. So getting that feedback, while at the times it's hard, isn't it? I think of some of the most rough and terse feedback. I love it now. Working in sport, as you know, it's sharp, it's immediate, it's on the spot. I really like that. I have to temper out, though, when I work with other people who haven't gone from a sport or maybe a defence or that environment, and actually coach them a little bit more around it. And then after a while, if they are open to that, on the spot feedback, run with it.
Yeah, I'd say some of the best feedback I've had in my life at the time was probably, the hardest to take. I remember at a job interview once, and as applying for grants, and the question, the interviewer was like, well, "Why are you doing it like this way? You need support from other people." Like, I can do it my way if I want to do it my way, and I'll do it how I want to do it. Well, that's a weird thing to ask, but actually, it was spot on. Working with more, and I think this works in anything in life. Getting support from mentors, working with more experienced people to then find your own way. I wanted to find my own way first without working with, and that, it's so hard to take at the time, but and I live with that now. And yeah, and it was such a great piece of advice. But like you say, you've got to understand the person you're working with and work out the way in which they want their feedback delivered, or how you would deliver the feedback to an individual, because some people, it can be very different.
And I do have an overview I want to go through today, but before I go there, just one other question off pest. When you put all this content together, or all the work you're doing, what is it that drives you around this? Like when you think about the work you do, the research you do, pumping it out, is there an overall goal? Is it wanting to work with a team? Is it wanting to write more journals? Is there a thread?
My overall goal from the very, very start has been to help people, probably help people in a way that wasn't available. I played tennis when I was younger, so I was like a county champion. I played national events. And so probably from the talent-wise, I was okay. But from a psychological perspective, I needed support. So I probably, like you said, I needed someone like me. And so I think about that now, and always behind everything I do is the way of trying to help people, or athletes, coaches, leaders, kind of find a more effective way of doing what they're doing. And that for me is the motivation. And I do research within anti-doping now, and the motivation for that is protecting the health of young athletes, because they're maybe not aware of the risks of taking performance enhancing drugs. So it's about educating them. And so it's all about well-being of athletes, really, and supporting them and coaching.
I love that framework, and that really ties in, because I would love our audience to understand mental imagery deeper. And even from my own point of view, I've researched, taught. It's a real evolution, isn't it? That blend between reading and writing and consuming, and then you get real changes. You see what works with athletes, what works with coaches. So rough frame, I want to go through a definition of mental imagery and benefits. We'll look at the science behind imagery. You told me there's some conflicting evidence or research around this, so a bit of scandal to start. We'll talk about external or internal perspectives. I've heard you also on a recent podcast talk about imagery ability. I'd never heard of that. PETTLEP, which is the go-to that I use, the acronym PETTLEP, so the 7 areas we use when you're making imagery real and bringing scripts together. Kinesthetic mental imagery, a little bit around that, and then reps and sets. So it's a real tutorial guide which fits in exactly what you're wanting to do, to give people practical information backed in science, but really making sure that it can work for people, whether it's sport for this audience or for some of our high performers in multiple domains. Hey, and I also want to talk about Jiu Jitsu, you crazy mofo, and how at your tender age, in your mid-40s, you're still banging out, and I'm sure you got to use some mental skills in that. So do you want to stick to that order, or do you want to flip it and talk about Jiu Jitsu first?
We'll finish with the Jiu Jitsu. Yeah. I definitely use mental skills in that, absolutely.
So a rough definition, tell me how much this needs to evolve, and some of this comes from your work and your book as well. Mental imagery involves creating or recreating the experiences of performing in your mind, and it shares neural and behavioural similarities to the genuine experience. So I tell athletes what that means is the brain doesn't know the difference between what is real and what is imagined.
Yeah, that's really good. It doesn't know what's real and what's imagined, because when we're imagining, say if you're imagining a tackle, a goal kick, tennis serve, the muscles that you would be that are activated when hitting those or making those movements are activated at a very, very minute level. So it helps create memories in your brain, strengthening the pathways, and it also helps you gain. By creating this imagery, you get this long-term memory patterns of movement. So all of those things contribute to it helping performance. But what I would say as well is when engaging in imagery, for your listeners, it's about employing as many or all of the senses. So it's not just about seeing yourself hitting a tennis serve, it's about feeling yourself hitting a tennis serve. The noises of if you play in front of a crowd, the noises of the crowd, but the noise of the ball connecting with the racket, the landing if you've made a jump, any smells associated with tennis. Like, I think for rugby players, it's quite an easy one. Often, if they're in DP or freeze spray, there's often the smells associated with that. Or golf, it's the smell of the grass. You want as many of those senses engaged as possible because
track and field, there's a real smell of a tartan track, especially if it's hot.
Yeah.
You can smell, almost feel the tartan as well. So yeah, I like that, bringing in multi-senses: sight, taste, sound, smell, and touch. And we'll get to PETTLEP. We had a fascinating guy. He's become a corporate buddy of mine, a guy named Matt Formston. I don't know if you've ever heard of Matt. Matt was born full eyesight, started to lose it with a rare genetic disorder at 5 years of age. He's got only 3% of vision in his left eye, so he's technically blind. He's been to the Olympics in cycling. He's world champion surfing as well. He's just surfed Nazare. He was towed in, so legally blind, towed in to a 50-foot open face wave. Now, that's 15 metres, and he's just produced a video on this as well. It's freaking ridiculous. I've got some audio I'll get Wizard to play, which is from a recent discussion I did with Matt. He talks about sixth sense, and in preparation for this, I've got to get the good professor to give me his view on what he thinks about the sixth sense. So let's play that audio, Wiz. And I've heard you say that you can be in a room and someone is not listening, and you'll say, "Hey, Penny, what's wrong?" And then Penny will jolt because she thinks you said you don't have sight, so she's there texting, but you feel Penny not paying attention.
The way I would describe it, it's like colours that are coming from a different area, or magnetism as well. It's like, if you can imagine, magnets are pulling or pushing depending on how the magnet is orientated. I think the way it works is energy. It might be resonance or something else that I'm picking up on, but it's almost a visual sense in my mind, like a visual. If you think about visual, if you have memory, like if you've got a visual memory, it's almost like that visual memory, but it's not a memory. It's something that's happening right now. You're present with that visual memory of something happening.
Can you teach that to other people?
I think it's just being present, and yes, I think we can teach it to other people. I think it would be very difficult to learn without losing sight, because I think sighted people rely a lot on what they see. And that rightly so, because that's their experience. We learn from our experiences, and you learn to trust things, and you learn to not trust things if they're not trustworthy. So if you've got a lifetime of trusting what you see, to move away from that sense would be very difficult. But I think it's absolutely trainable. But I think it starts with just being present, because I think a lot of times people don't need to be present all the time because they can rely on sight or hearing or one or the other and come back to it.
I've brought Matt into a number of teams I work with, Adam. And he does his story, and he walks in and they go, "Is this guy really blind?" He said he's like a bat with sonar, that if he goes somewhere once, he'll just ask, "Hey, what's happening with a bollard?" And there's a real pattern when you're going to airports. And then once he's done it once, he can remember it. So isn't it fascinating? So we talk about the 5 senses, the 5 faculties. He absolutely believes, and has other people he's spoken to that believe there's this sixth sense you can develop. So I just wanted to throw that at you early in the interview. It's not a normal question you get as a professor in sports psych, is it?
No, definitely not. That's really, really interesting. So it's more than his memory. So for example, the bollard. So, for example, if he didn't know there was a bollard there, he'd not been to a place, would he be able to feel that there was a bollard there anyway?
He'll have his walking stick.
Oh, okay.
And if you're with him, so when we went to the Institute of Sport in January, he came and did a couple of days with Manly Seagulls, and the boys just loved his story as well. And they were saying after that, "I'm never going to complain," when you hear his story. So he'll walk with you and then say, "I can feel the rubber here. Like, what is it? There's some steps coming up." So there's real patterns in his brain and association. And so then he'll do it once, and that's locked into his memory, and then he can do it next time. And people will see him without a cane and go, "Is this guy is he having us on? Like, is he really blind?"
Yeah. So that sounds like he's just got a really highly developed memory, because he's had to develop that memory. But yeah, that's interesting as well. Yeah, I've not heard that before, but very, really interesting.
And he thinks, when you talk about imagery and senses, that he uses it. So even though he could see when he was young, so he still has some memory association, he'll feel the water when he's surfing, toe-in surfing. He'll really tune into the sound. So his other senses are more heightened. because he's lost vision.
I could see that. And I think, there's evidence even with imagery is, when you do it well, the more you do it, the better you become at doing that. So, for example, your kinesthetic feelings will become heightened. Your sense of probably smell does as well. But I know certainly with imagery, other senses become stronger. You become better at doing it. And I guess because he's had to rely on it more and use it more, he's probably like a world expert on imagery, really, in all the senses as well.
And he's just so present. Every time I catch up with him, you honestly feel like you're the only person talking to him. And then he can shift to the next person and they feel the same. So he's really just honed in on this presence and connection. Very impressive.
And that's really hard to do. I think in modern society, it's really hard to do that, isn't it? Be present, because you've always got, 101 things that we need to be doing. Picking your kids up, writing that paper, doing this, doing that. And actually to be fully present is, I must admit, I've started doing mindfulness practice and doing it seriously, and that has made a big difference.
Well, what sort of dose? How many minutes a day?
So 20 minutes a day, every day. Obviously I miss some days, but I try and do it. I built up, started at 5, and went to 10. And do you know what? Because I actually thought, because I've done a lot of imagery in the past just through sports and things, and I thought I'd really struggle to do it. But actually I was quite surprised. Guided mindfulness, so, you go on YouTube and selecting some. And one thing I actually felt was that your feelings are not you, they're separate. And that came from the mindfulness. How I'm feeling is not me, it's a separate, it's weird, it's really difficult to explain. And and that's really helped. But that helps you become more present, I think.
It does, and they're so intertwined, aren't they? When you're teaching mental skills, you don't just go, hey, we're going to focus on mental imagery for the next month, and then we'll move into meditation and mindfulness as well. But just closing out on mindfulness, I like the two phases. I first heard Michael Gervais talk about this, and Michael was talking about the first of all is awareness around your thoughts, your feelings, your body and the environment you're in. And then the second depth, which you're talking about, is its insight and wisdom. So the more of it you do, and I think they talk about on a lot of mindfulness, the minimum effective dose, starts at about 6 minutes, 20 to 25 minutes of training for about 8 weeks is where apparently the magic happens. But with footballers, especially that work I'm doing in NRL and work in rugby, I'd say the boys 10 minutes. That's our gold standard. If you can get 10 minutes a day, 6 days a week, have a day off, either the Sabbath or a resting day. If you could do 60 minutes a week of mindfulness training, it's also 60 minutes you're not on your bloody mobile phone. It does wonders for your brain. It does wonders for your relationship.
It really does. But it's kind of sticking to that, isn't it? That's the thing with anything in life, isn't it? It's adhering to it. But it really does.
I better use a bit of the definition of mindfulness, which is being present in the moment, to bring us back to imagery, because we'll jump around and we'll start. With your depth and knowledge, we could just go up rabbit holes and down this area. We'll take everyone on a wonderful 4-hour journey. It'll be like a Joe Rogan episode. We'll go for hours.
That's how I view psychological skills, is that, as academics, we write about them separately, but actually they're all intertwined. I'm a coping researcher, stress and coping. And so all the coping strategies involve imagery, involve self-talk, involve thought stopping, deep breathing, relaxation strategies. So when I'm teaching athletes or people, leaders to cope effectively with stress, I encourage them and train them in using all of these different coping strategies, depending on the situation. So I think you do need a knowledge of, we're talking about imagery today, but actually that you can and should use it in combination with other strategies.
I like the analogy of a builder. So he rocks up to your place and hole and you go, all right, you're going to do a bit of a reno. Got a nice old period house there, and he rocks in it. He's got 10 different hammers, 5 saws, a couple of different chisels, 15 screwdrivers. So it's the right tool at the time. You can't just bang everything with a hammer. Now let me just bang something with a hammer. The science underpinning imagery. So can you explain to people what's really going on? So when I said that at the start, the brain doesn't know the difference between the imagined and the real. You live, breathe this. You could give us a 10 and you could talk about psychoneuromuscular theory. You could talk about symbolic learning theory and bioinformational theory. Hang in there, ladies and gents. You could also talk about triple code model. So I know you can go really deep, and I know you can also do this in a more user-friendly. Meet me halfway. What's going on?
So my favourite theory is, and there is some support for all of the theories, is psychoneuromuscular theory, and we just touched upon that. But essentially what that means is when you're imaging, the muscles are activated. So when if you just sit still and you imagine yourself walking, the leg muscles will be activating at a very, very small activation level. And that's how it can then subsequently help performance in some ways, because it's creating the activation of and recruitment of different muscles. I'd say that, I think when I work with athletes, that's the way I kind of mention it, because I think it's quite easy to understand, and there's evidence to support it. And then, but the other one is this bioinformational theory, in which actually states that when you image, the images you have are stored as memory patterns, so that when you then need it in a specific sporting situation, you're going into, I don't know, a big playoff final or even a local club competition. If you've imagined yourself before, those images you'll have will be stored in your mind. So when you're then at the competition, you've kind of got that to fall back on. So you
so that explains when you have an athlete. I was saying this before we pressed recorder. One of the players I'm working with at the Wallabies, he was actually in a game. Can I emphasise this? Is Australia beat England. It's the first time we've done it for 12 years at Twickenham. I was delighted to be at that game, Adam. And after the game, one of the boys I've been working with came up and said, "Maisie, I did what we'd been doing, and it was like I'd done it 1,000 times." So it was a set play he'd been working on, and he'd done the imagery and he'd done the training, but hadn't actually done it in a game. So that's the theory around that. When someone comes and says, "It's like I'd done it 1,000 times," it's because they'd done the mental reps and sets, and then they got in the cauldron and it just clicked into gear.
And they've got those memories stored in their mind, the images stored in their mind. So then when it really happens, they know what to do. In fact, Israel Adesanya, the UFC fighter, has spoken about this in some of his after-fight conferences. I think he said before one of his last fights, or one of his world championship fights, how he'd been in the venue the night before and imaged himself. He imaged his walkout, did the walkout, stood in the ring. So he said by the time it came to him fighting, he'd already imagined what was going to happen. And that then gives you a sense of reassurance, but it also allows you to perform more effectively too.
I came here with my crew and we rehearsed the entrance, and I did it probably about 4 times or 5 times, and I did the whole walkout and I visualized everything, and I did the whole prep point thing, and I stepped in the cage and I claimed the space, and I did that about 4 or 5 times. And I also did the win, the victory, like just visualizing it, and I imagined the whole place lit up with people and loud cheerings and boos and people by the side, what they're saying to you, and just practicing it. And amazingly, when I got to the prep point again before the walkout, it just felt even more deja. There's levels to this shit, man. It just felt like, man, I just did this shit yesterday, which I did.
And so sense of reassurance would also be calm. And for anyone listening to this, we often misconstrue the word calm. I think calm is being the right activation. So you're ready to perform, you're ready for battle. But if you look at the inverted U hypothesis, you're not hyper alert, and then you start to lose memory and you're jumpy. So it's the confidence, isn't it, doing this as well? So you're calm, ready for battle, and then go, yeah, I've got this. I'm in the right state. I've done the training. I've done the work. I can draw on that. Let's rip in.
Yeah, and I think for different people, the right state is different. You know, some people do need to be a little more psyched up, for want of a better word. Others need to be more relaxed. Some need to have a bit more focus. So I don't think there's always a kind of a right way for everybody. It's always individual. That's how I kind of view it.
Yeah, and different for sport. I used to work in cricket. And so when I was working with the New South Wales cricket team, then I worked with the Aussie team back in 2005. That was an epic battle, if you remember then. The Ashes came down between Warney and Kevin Peterson, the 5th test on the 5th day. So there'd been 25 days of cricket and it was still there on a knife edge. It was theatre. But before a 5-day test match, the coach will be like, all right, boys, let's get out there and get a good start. Or the captain goes, okay, let's have a first good spell this first 2 hours. And then the rugby union or rugby league dressing room is like, right, fucking let's rip it. Like you got the Tyrannosaurus Rex, you know, your second rows or your locks who are just there like ready to go into fucking war. It's really interesting, isn't it? You got cricket and you got, all right, boys, let's have a good 5 days. And then you got 80 minutes of footy. Let's fucking rip in. So it is very, very context specific, not just for the personality, but I think for the sport and for the position.
Yeah, I'd definitely say position. I played fly half when I was younger at rugby union, and I wasn't into all that. I just like to be a little bit calmer. Yeah, I didn't really like to tackle much as most fly halves do. I just like to, do my stuff. And
they're the Julios, aren't they? The fly halves. They're the pretty boys and get all the cash and good interviews and have media careers long after. They don't have the cauliflower ears.
No, they don't. No, they don't.
I'll make sure.
It is interesting. Like, what I think Yuri Hanin, who I did actually meet a few times, he had this zones of optimal functioning where, again, people have, different emotions are required for people to perform at their optimal level. And I think that was really an interesting piece of work, and it's something that I've kind of used quite frequently.
I like how we're having that dance as well, and it really is skill and practice. As you said, you can't just isolate. So imagery will help you get into that optimal zone. It'll also help you calm down and down regulate as well. Now, when we talk about imagery, internal or external, and I've really got into this the last 18 months and doing a lot with rehab as well, with injury rehab. And I've got a couple of questions I want to ask you about that. But my understanding of external perspective, I listened to a podcast you did in preparation for this discussion on the trainer's bullpen, and the host had a really good analogy or a summary on that. He said external perspective is third person. It's like you're watching yourself from outside of your body. You're like a spectator. And the internal perspective, he said, it's first person. It's what you see through your own eyes, almost like you're there sort of playing it out.
He's a real good guy, Chris. He's an ex-police officer and trainer, but it's about external imagery is about seeing it through the lens of a video camera. So if someone had a video camera up while you were performing and they were filming you, that would be the external imagery, and you'd use imagery that way. Whereas other people, when they engage in imagery, what they would look at when they're performing the movement themselves through the first person. And what the research has shown generally is that you let people choose their own way of imaging. Some people will do the external imagery through the video camera, some will do the internal imagery, and some will do a little bit of both. And generally the evidence shows that you allow people to select their own perspective. So kind of what works for them is you leave them to that.
Okay, it's interesting. Some papers I've read, and this is one of the questions I had for you, that internal perspective is more useful when learning a skill or developing a skill. But are you saying it doesn't really matter whether it's internal, through my eyes, external? I think the other example Chris said, it's like you've got a drone above you, so you're looking down or looking in the grandstand. I like that analogy. And I've had some athletes who will say they use both and flip. So interesting hearing you say that as well. So there's not one size fits all. Research doesn't say you start internal, go external.
Yeah, I think there's always like a lot of the experimental papers are done with kind of college students. They're not kind of with high level athletes, and they're generally very, very simple tasks. So maybe throwing a beanbag, throwing a dart. So they're not really representative of competitive sport. And so I think for beginners, the external perspective is, they say it enhances learning. But as a coach, if you're working with people, they're generally not learning. They're already experts. It's not very often when I'm working with athletes that they're learning new skills. They're generally higher level athletes. And overall, when you look at interviews with high level athletes, they all generally just prefer their own way of doing it. And I wouldn't particularly kind of change the way an athlete was imaging, just on the off chance that it might help, because it might actually disrupt their imagery.
I want to get your view on this as well, and if I'm doing the wrong thing, I apologise to all the athletes I've been working with in the last 2 years, but I'll use a worksheet like that on mental imagery and give the athletes just a bit of an overview of what it is. We do a mind gym, which you're familiar with, just like you go to the gym with our good mate JC. Hey, I should mention JC or John Clark because he originally put me onto you as well. So if I don't give him a shout out, he'll be like, "Hey pal, like, mate, where's me shout out, pal?" So JC said he'd followed you for a number of years, and that's how I first got onto your work. So big hello to JC, and thanks for the introduction.
Yeah, he's a good guy. Yeah, thanks for introducing us, Josie. We spoke a couple of times. Yeah, he's a good guy, isn't he?
Good man, good energy. So when I talk about imagery, I'll just get the athlete to write down external or internal perspective. Close your eyes and imagine yourself grabbing the ball. So this is rugby union specific, running past the opposition players and scoring a try right under the post. And I give them nothing else. And then just map out how you see it. Then I'll ask them, was it through your eyes? Or was it up in the grandstand? So was it internal or external? And I find there's a real mix. And as you said, I find some even flip between the two.
Yeah, and they do. And I think it's important to reassure people that one perspective is not better than the other. Because some people might get worried, should I be doing it this way? Or would that help my performance more? And actually, no, it wouldn't. It's just the important thing is that you're doing some form of imagery.
Great. So I haven't been harming or maiming anybody by doing that activity.
No, that's the best. Yeah, it's like Dave Collins always says, it depends. It depends. And it does. I think a lot of psychology, it does depend. It depends on the person, what their preferences are, what they feel comfortable with. And if you're doing something that someone feels comfortable with and enjoys doing, then they're much more likely to do it. And then that'll then reinforce their well-being and performance.
I've heard you talk about imagery ability. It was the first time I'd heard about that.
Yeah, so a key factor that determines whether an imagery intervention will be successful or not is an athlete's or a person's imagery ability. So if you mentioned that business leaders might be listening to this. So if you're imagining yourself giving a talk, a presentation, some people can't. They just can't imagine at all. Have a very, very poor image ability. Not necessarily at the elite end of sport. The elite end of sport, high-level sport performers generally have a much better imagery level. So it's probably more kind of like amateur athletes. And some people can't imagine whatsoever. It's a condition. I can't remember the name of the condition, but whenever I post on LinkedIn about this, I'll always get someone saying, yeah, but not everybody can do imagery.
Aphantasia, which is the inability to have a visual experience when we are thinking about things in their absence, says Dr. Adam Zeman, Honorary Professor of Neurology at the University of Exeter. I had an athlete 18 months ago who had aphantasia. I'm pretty sure had aphantasia, because you'll work with some athletes and they go, I can't get this, Maisie. And then you'll get into a little bit more, okay, and we'll get to PETTLEP next, but get them on the grass, get the boots on, get the ball. I was a basketballer I was working with as well, bounce the ball, get on the court. So you can hear that noise in a basketball court. Now go through it, and I find when you do that and make it real, so back to what we were saying with Matt Formston, as many senses as possible, touch, taste, sight, sound, smell, I find that is an unlock. But I reckon this one guy I had did have aphantasia, but I didn't know back at that stage, actually it was more than 18 months, it was probably 2.5 years ago. I didn't know how I would assess your imagery ability. So I think if I'd maybe done that scale, it would have helped. Yeah,
so there are different imagery ability questionnaires that can be used. And they get you to measure the imagery ability. But what generally happens, so we can improve imagery ability over time. So for example, if somebody scores very low, most people can improve what they do. Now, just a quick question then. So I've never worked with anyone who had, is it aphantasia or?
Aphantasia, so.
We don't know he definitely had it, but.
No, but thought. So Fantasia, the Latin word for fantasy, A is the opposite, so inability to fantasize.
Now, could this individual do the noises, the smells, or could he just not? That's one thing I always wonder when people write that on LinkedIn. Can they make use of the other senses?
Yeah, not well, but I think, and I've learned a lot since then. I'd love to go back and do it with him now and check, but he had a real block as well because he'd been with coaches and been in other high-performance programs and couldn't do it. And I think he was a bit embarrassed. So I think it's that whole capability, confidence as well. And, you lose confidence, you don't have capability, it spirals down. So I think there was a bit of that lack of confidence in it, looking back. But one thing he did have, and you're testing me now in the archive, is there was some kinesthetic. So he had some memory of just the feel. So we'd use words more of how do you feel?
Yeah, and that goes with what my understanding is as well, is that some people are better at visual imagery, some people are better at kinesthetic imagery, some people are better at smelling or noises, and that, you know, working with the athlete to kind of use their senses and working on what they can do best, but then also trying to develop the other senses. But some people do struggle with the physical kinesthetic imagery. One thing that I do when I'm, and this is something your listeners can do, it's quite an interesting little exercise. So you get a string and tie it to a paperclip, and then you have like a little north, south, east, west compass. Lock in your arm, and then you try and move it just with your by imagining it. And it's your fingers, obviously no swinging, just keep your hands still. And I do this with my students every year, and like, you know, I'm pretty lucky. I can swing it. I can make it swing north to south. I can make it stop. I can go east to west. I can even do it diagonally if I want to. And that's another good way of measuring image ability, potentially, especially your kinesthetic imagery. And it's a good little tool. It's the students love it. I reckon the rugby lads could quite like that. You go in and it's a way of explaining how what you're doing is working, because there's no swinging. It's just the muscles in your fingers and your thumb are activating the string.
So you got the neurons firing, and then that's carrying all the way down to the fingertips with the little.
They're activated. Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool.
It does feel quite strange, because I can do it pretty well. I can get it, you know, really. I can actually feel it in my. So I'm not trying to move my finger and my thumb. I'm trying to move it, you know, with my mind, but it does actually feel quite, the string moving in your hand and your fingers does feel, it's quite a strange sensation. But some, they don't get it moving at all. You know, they could be stood there 5 minutes and it's just, it's not moved. But
you write about that in one of your posts, kinesthetic mental imagery. So most people can visualize, but when their minds go blank, they struggle to create images. So instead focus on the feelings associated with performance, which is known as kinesthetic mental imagery. You remember this? This is your words. You've written that many posts. You're probably going, where does this come from? For athletes who focus more on feeling the sight, kinesthetic mental imagery may be more effective. You talk about feelings of performing a particular skill, like body feelings associated with kicking a ball, noises associated with the task, the noise when a cricketer strikes a ball for 6 runs. Gee, that's a sweet smell, isn't it? Or a sweet sound, and then smells associated with images. So that's what you mean by that kinesthetic mental imagery. You're building that feeling into it.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. I don't play golf anymore now, but I used, I played golf, got down to 4. So, a reasonable club golfer. But one thing I struggled with was imagining the flight of the ball. Whereas the feel of the swing, I could, do that very, very easily. So for me, kinesthetic imagery was probably better than visual imagery. I'd speak to some people and they'd be like, yeah, particularly like high level young golfers, they could visualize the arc of the ball, or the point in the air, which is the optimum height of the ball, and it'll drop, and how the ball will run out. I struggled with that, but the feeling of the swing, I could do that very, very comfortably.
I've visualized multiple times swinging the ball and going to the lake, and that happened. So I've run on some of the best. I've run on St Andrews and didn't play golf there. And friends of mine who are golfers, they just think that's sacrilege. I've run in Australia where they play the Australian Open. I've run on the K Club in Dublin. So I can tell you some good stories about running around some of the world's best golf courses, but I'm a horrible golfer, so I'll leave the golf stories to you.
Probably more enjoyable in some sense, because these championship courses, I've been to a couple, they're just set up so difficult. I think, for like a low, mid single figure handicap golfer, you just struggle. They're so long and difficult.
Well, 4's good. So you got down that's single figures.
Yeah, it was okay. Yeah, I just bad shoulder and and lack of time.
Did you have a good sports psych to work with you?
I used the imagery there massively. I used that really helped. Yes, I used to do that before every round I'd play. I recorded an 8-minute imagery script. That's another thing as well. Imagery is more effective when it's guided imagery. That is a new study that's just come out. So rather than just getting an individual just to image for 5 minutes, you get them, record a script. And I had this, and I used to listen to this before every round of golf, and it made a big difference, I think.
I've got that research. Gosh, it's like you've read my running notes. 2024, I'm going to totally stuff up the name, but Budnik Przygalowska, sounds like Russian psychologist, examined the effects of guided imagery recorded by somebody else and self-produced imagery. The athletes create their images and they assess the effects of guided versus self-produced imagery. I was fascinated at that study because I've been dancing with both as well. So to give people an understanding, a script is when you will work with an athlete and you script out. I'll record this on a phone. I got this from Sean Anderson, so big shout out to Sean. He's a Canadian, did psychology, almost went to the Olympics. You know, I think some of the best performance psychologists, your story as well, you know, good, not great, my story as well. So I think we have that inner desire, wanting to tap out what could have I done better, and then that desire to help other people. So Sean put me onto this, a script where you'll actually ask the athlete, so tell me about a phase play or tell me about something you want to nail. With different sports, I'm curious on what you do. If I try and do it, like, you know, when you go and work with a new sport, it's like a different language. So I started in rugby union recently and they talk about bus, jeep, or no, truck, jeep, bike, all the different moves. You're like, what the fuck are they talking about? So it is really a different language. So I'll say to players, hey, I know this stuff works, but I'm not going to butcher. So can you please tell me word for word, what are you doing in a passage of play? So you get the ball in good shape, you see an opening, bang, talk me through that and make it as real in their words as possible. Then I'll record it and play back to them, and then get them to do a number of reps and sets. So I had spoken to Sean, I'd heard a few other people. So when I saw this research that you put out there, I was delighted to hear the results on that doing those scripts. And tell me a little bit more detail around this, but reading your post on this, doing these scripts gets better results generally than when you ask an athlete to do it themselves.
Yeah, so I kind of have a similar approach to you. So what I would normally do is, so I will, like I say, you need to speak to the athlete, you need to understand the athlete, you need to understand their language. And then what I would then generally do is kind of adapt a script, and then I'd email it to them so they can have a look at the script. Have I got anything wrong? Because you don't want to be in a situation where, you know, they're doing their imagery and they're actually distracted by you making a blunder, which clearly shows you have no understanding of what they're trying to do.
The image I've got is David Brent in The Office, you know, when the UK version, he's coming out with Simply the Best and everyone's just going, oh, this is horrible. So, you know, he's telling everyone he's a great performer.
Okay, well, that's about it from yours truly. Thanks for taking all I had to throw at you. I'm spent. But, I am now going to make like a banana and split. He got it. Okay, before I go though, promise me you'll remember one thing, yeah? Just remember... Come on, listen to her. Get into it. Yeah. I've been dating friends. You've been the best.
I think there's a risk of us doing that if you don't get the athlete. That's a good take-out for me today, to then send it to the athlete. Actually, with a couple of athletes, I've re-recorded because they said, nah, that bit's not right. And I've actually then asked them, okay, tell me, what do you need word for word?
Yeah, and then they'll edit it and send it back, and then you then record it. And some athletes have actually preferred to record it themselves when they've done that. I'm happy with that because it's up to them. But most generally would ask you then to record it, and then you then like email it over as a voice for MP4 file or whatever it is, and then they would listen to it. But yeah, I think the guided imagery is really, really good because it just gives the athletes a focus of what they're doing. It allows you then to modify it as time goes on. It might then or their coaches ask them to work on some new patterns of play, new defensive structures, or whatever that may be, and then embedding that within the imagery that they've already got, or adapting it.
What do you find as well, Adam, when you do a script? Does the athlete use that for a while and then they go to doing it themselves? Or is it again similar to when we're talking internal, external? Is it different with every athlete, or is there a pattern that you followed in your practice around that?
Yeah, first what I say it's different with every athlete. Some athletes will use it for a long, long period of time. Others will want different recordings because they get a bit bored. And I remember one athlete in particular, we nailed the script, and he just wanted to use that, and he did use that. And then others they'll also be able to do what's in the script themselves. I've always said about just having the structure is important, because it allows you know that you're going to be practicing imagery for a set amount of time, whether that's 8 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever that may be. And then doing your own imagery as well is really good. So some will do it just before they go to bed or on the bus without using imagery script. But just so you're getting that quality, the quality of the reps in, really. That's but then obviously it always depends on the athlete, and I'm always guided by the athlete or the coach or the person you're working with.
And using PETTLEP as a framework. So we've jumped around in our order, but I think it's good. It's been a really natural flow. So PETTLEP, 2001, Holmes and Collins proposed a model of imagery that really links physical and those imagined movements. So PETTLEP, physical, environment, task, timing, learning, emotion and perspective. Now you write about this in what I have been told is the most purchased sports psychology manual ever. So I'm just going to set up the frame and shut up. Talk to me about PETTLEP.
I don't know about that, but I absolutely love this. I think traditionally, sports psychologists, when they would use imagery, not just sports psychologists, would say, right, lie down on your bed, now do some imagery. But actually what the PETTLEP goes against that, they want to incorporate as much physical sensations, not as much as physical, but they want to include the physicality into imagery. And how do you do that? Well, using the sports kit that you would wear, using the equipment. So if you're a hockey player, hold a hockey stick. If you're a rugby player, hold a rugby ball. And actually try and make some of the movements you would perform while using the imagery. So an issue is that people can feel maybe a bit self-conscious. Will Rugby Pass did a great video with one of their referees who was filming himself going through his mental imagery in his preparation for a match, which essentially involved him. He was at a park reffing an imaginary match that was going on while people were running around the athletics track. Now, do you know what? I thought that was brilliant, because he was not self-conscious whatsoever.
I thought he'd lost the total plot. Referees get a bad rap as it is, poor guy. I imagine they actually would have gone, what's got into this guy? He's lost the plot.
What's going on in his... But then there's also other examples, some great examples of ice hockey goaltenders. I posted one the other day where he's actually in his full kit at the arena, and he's clearly doing mental imagery and he's moving at the same time. He's the only one on the ice. But that actually strengthens the imagery. It makes it more effective. There's been some studies showing that incorporating movement within imagery and doing it in the kit, and even if you can do it within the environment, it makes it much stronger.
So you got physical, do it in the environment. So wear the kit. I did see that one you posted on ice hockey. So he's on the ice, obviously got all the gear. You mentioned tasks and making sure it's really similar or identical in nature as well. And timing. That when I looked at PETTLEP and started doing more, that is one thing that I changed. I think I'd been working with athletes, and even some of the imagery I'd done myself, I was going way too long. Or way too slow. It was almost like I was doing it in slow motion. But this research shows, or this model, do it in the time it's in.
Yeah, because it's more realistic. And if you look at why imagery works, it's about strengthening those image patterns. Well, if it's too fast or too slow, it's not real. It's not going to formulate a realistic vision in your memory of what it would look like. So you spoke about the rugby player who imagined the move that he had to make. Well, if he'd done it too slow or too fast, when it actually came to performing that movement during a match, he wouldn't have a reliable sense of what that would feel like. Whereas now, if it's at the real time, he does have that. He would have had that, hopefully. Yeah, and then another key thing about is imagery is about embedding learning. So what is your current athlete's state of learning? As they become more proficient, say imagery, or they become more efficient in their skill, you might then want to change the imagery, or you should change the imagery and then work on other elements that they need to adapt in their game. So, for example, a coach might say, right, we're going to work on this part of your game. You need to improve it. I don't know, maybe your passing, your tackling, or whatever that may be. And that's why you would then embed this within their imagery. And as they get more proficient or they get asked to work on other things, their current state of progress will be reflected in the imagery.
And how do you use this, or how have you seen this used in the research around injury rehab? It's one of the open loops I had that I said I wanted to come back to. So I'm seeing, well, obviously a number of physios that I work with are wanting to build this in. If you look at rehab, there's really the 3 phases. There's the acute phase. You've got to get the diagnosis, let the athlete settle down. Then you start getting into the rehab, and that can be a time frame, anything from a couple of weeks to months. And then you've got integration back into proper training and then playing. So do you look at different types of imagery in all those 3 areas, or what's your view on how to use imagery to get athletes back? Yeah. Because there's research around blood flow, and we're talking about skill acquisition. You can still get the muscle firing even if you're not doing the sport.
Yeah, I guess it's all very much dependent upon the athlete and how comfortable they feel. Because I guess some athletes, as we know, when they get injured, can experience, depending on the length of the injury, can experience quite bad mental health. And so some of them might not be ready to start at phase 1 or but maybe hopefully once they've had the surgery, and that's when things are going on the up, and they know when they're starting the rehab, actually this is the sign that things are progressing. Yes, I think it's really important to deep breathing exercises, visualization, particularly this skill acquisition, because if people are out for a long time, sometimes they might need to kind of relearn things depending upon the injury. So that can be really useful, I think.
Interesting you say that. JC was saying that in a meeting that we had recently, that he thinks when you're injured, he said, obviously you want to support the player, but he said he went back to one time he was injured and he really shifted his mind from being sad and the world's against me to, hey, I've got an opportunity and I can really learn some skills, or this is a time where I can really focus on some other areas. So not doing it in a kitsch way, but to spin that and go, hey, you may not get the time with the support to actually learn some more of these skills. So I like hearing you say that in a different way.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think doing that, it's actually really good. You're completely changing your mindset and you're adapting what is known as like this challenge mindset. So threat is about worried about what's going to go wrong. Am I going to be able to return to play? Am I going to be the same player I was? Whereas this challenge mindset, I'm going to, like JC said, I'm going to learn these new skills. I'm going to actually become even better when I return because I'll have learned these new skills. So kind of the mindset has gone from, am I going to be the same player, to I'm actually going to be a better player when I return because I'll have learned whatever these new skills are. And adopting that mindset will also generate more positively toned emotions. So it's actually really good for your well-being to have that mindset.
And that really links to that second E on the PETTLEP model, just to close that out, emotion. Emotion, Barbara Fredrickson talks about broaden and build theory. So the collective sum of experiences we have broadens and builds. You're injured, you're not playing, you're not out getting the same banter, and you can start to kick stones and broaden and build. But the flip on this you're saying is, hey, you can use that as an experience, but you can use imagery for a more positive experience, whether you're injured or not.
Yeah, and first of all, what I'd say is when working with coaches actually is when athletes are injured, try, or you should be including them as much as possible. Can they do any match analysis? Can they do any scouting? Can they should still be involved so that actually does help the return to play. But yeah, in terms of emotions, how are you feeling when you're playing sport? Because that should be included in the imagery. And if, for example, you may have a tendency to be maybe too anxious when playing sport, okay, well, experience that anxiety with imagery, but also imagine yourself overcoming that imagery. Imagine the coping strategies that you will use, and then see yourself playing, but feeling in a confident way.
So when you do a script, do you look at PETTLEP yourself, or do you try and guide the athlete to use as many of those as possible? And then the final P, perspective, we've spoken about that, whether it's internal or external, and we've said it doesn't really matter. It's more what the athlete uses or what they find works best for them. So yeah, will you use that as a framework for a script?
Yeah, so what I'll do is I'll speak to the athletes to find out, get to know them, and then I will then introduce the different concepts, and I'll always say, because often, although I try to keep everything practical, I'm also very much underpinned by the literature and evidence base. So I'll say, well, the evidence really does support this model, and I'll go through the different bits and explain why it could be useful to them to use, or we create an imagery script together which is based around this model. And then if there's any bits that they really don't want to include, for example, and one athlete might not want to include any emotion in there because actually it could trigger, more anxiety. So we would then not use that potentially. Always guided by the athlete. But yeah, and I try to include as much of this as possible and not have it, not make it too long. And again, for some athletes, what is too long? That's the question. It might be that you do a 10-minute script and they find it too long. So you actually shorten it. But for other athletes might prefer a longer script. So it's always, I would always try and incorporate this in because, and I would say about the evidence to support it.
Timing, reps and sets. You mentioned before you can do in training, you could do on the bus. Have you seen much research that shows the best time to do imagery? And have you seen research what's the latest research on frequency?
That's the thing. There's not really a great deal on that. What'll happen is you'll get some studies, and they'll show, does this intervention work? They use this imagery 4 or 5 times a week for 6 weeks, and this is the results. So I think a lot of this goes on your intuition, your experience as a sports psychologist, your own use of imagery, and then also the feelings of the player. So what I suggest generally is when I'm working with an athlete would be always, every day for a week, and then start to experiment with different timings. And it might be that for some people, after the second week, they might use it just before a training session or just before a match. It really does, kind of vary upon the athlete. And you don't want it to become too much of a burden, but equally you want them to learn, if that makes sense. It's really difficult to, and I think I go by case, but I would always say at least a week. It just gets the imagery going, and then they generally start to use it outside of listening to the script.
Do you know Richard Fryer? He's an Englishman who's now here in Australia. Richard works with the Mental Performance and Competition Unit of the Australian Sports Commission. Have you met him along your travels?
No.
So he gave me a synthesis of a paper. I was talking to him about a different project we're involved in a couple of months ago. He also works in NRL as well. He works with the Australian Olympic archery team. He's a good man, he's very knowledgeable in imagery, especially with archery, because they use a lot of it. Because they get a lot of injury, shoulder injury, tendon injuries if they just pull the bow back because they're really strung, right? So they use a lot of imagery in that sport. There was a paper, BMC medicine paper, and this is Richard's synthesis of this paper. How to do imagery effectively. He said it's 4 key areas. Number 1, set up the environment and remove distractions. You've spoken about that. 2, set a clear focus, which motor skills and how many reps. 3, engage the parasympathetic nervous system. I found that interesting. Something like the physiological sigh or some breath work, so to build in relaxation so they're not in a stressed state. We know that enhances learning. And 4, with the session, run your reps using multiple senses, at least 3. And he said the overall summary though, on the practicalities was shorter, sharper sessions, but more frequent. And that was a really good insight for me. So rather than going long, 20 minutes at the end of a session, short, sharp, but more frequent.
Yeah, I would never do 20. Most of my sessions when I've recorded scripts are sort of 8 to 10 minutes. But the environment one's really interesting because if you look now, you look at a lot of I'm a big fan of the American college sports and American professional sport. A lot of them now will actually go and do their mental skills, same with the NBA, while the distractions are there. They do it in a tough environment. LeBron James, he was seen before the Olympics, the crowd, he was in the environment doing breath work. So I think when someone becomes a competent athlete and competent use of mental skills, why not go and do it in the environment in which you're expected to play? Because if you can imagine in a stressful environment,
because you've got distractions when you're playing. You've got people yelling at you.
Yeah, and if you go to the PETTLEP approach, it's about trying to do it in the environment. Again, they're all, it depends on the athlete you're working with, but that's one approach that when working with athletes, if they can do that, I would get them to do that. And I think it's JJ McCarthy. He was one of the top college quarterbacks. He's now in the NFL. And I posted about him who will actually go and sit and meditate in front of on the pitch before a match. And he'll be using visualization there as well. And he's actually doing it in the match environment. Takes his shoes off, sits there and does it. And I think that's great to see. And it's also, it's a testing place to do it, and it will definitely strengthen the imagery ability, I think, doing it in that environment.
This paper also spoke about some practicalities, that each motor skill should last between 5 to 15 seconds. So this is talking about contact sports. Reps should last around 15 seconds. Work to rest ratio is approximately equal. You can work up to 30 or 50 reps per session. The paper suggests more than 30 is required for long-term benefit, but it takes training effect to get to that. Optimal frequency is 3 to 5 times per week. And then you can build this in with regular microdosing. So I like that they're talking about just building this in, short, sharp, frequent.
Yeah, and I think the microdosing is really important. And one thing I would say when doing imagery, the rep stuff is more about, it's cognitive specific, isn't it? It's the actual learning of skills. Whereas one thing I kind of use generally more is this motivational general mastery. So it's the feelings around the imagery. So why are we doing imagery? Well, we're doing imagery, it depends on the person, but generally to kind of help the psychological side for preparation for when they're performing. So from that, kind of focus less on reps, but more on feelings associated with different performances. So getting them to imagine themselves feeling confident, feeling mentally tough, and what that feels like to them, what that looks like to them when engaging in imagery, and incorporating those key words within the scripts. And that's another thing I'd speak to the athlete. What are your key words you want to think about when performing a specific role that's embedded within your sport? Might be if you're a fullback catching a high ball. Right, okay, let's imagine these feelings just before you're about to catch the high ball, the ball's coming up, right? We want you to be feeling confident. And so I kind of focus more on the feelings as opposed to kind of specifically the reps per se. I guide, in fact, actually, I'm just thinking now, actually, I'm not too prescriptive in that. I'm actually quite, so I'll give them time within an imagery session to go through different skills, but I allow them to do it at their own rate and then put them focus on so I wouldn't say, right, imagine yourself 10 times catching a high ball. It'd be like, now you're going to be catching some high balls, different heights, different weather conditions, different challenges. It might be somewhere you're not challenged by a player. You then think of these different scenarios, but the key thing is imagine these key words around that.
So you're less prescriptive on the number. That's been a really good takeout for me today. So less, rather than a gym session where you're working on power, lifting 4 to 6, you go do deadlift and you might do a hang clean, and doing weighted chins where my background is in S&C, and you get very specific with people. Here's the exercise, here's the weight, here's the amount of lift or the amount of reps, and here's the recovery, work to rest ratio. But you're saying your experience with imagery is make it more about the feeling, less about the actual just ticking the box and going through the process.
Yeah, 100%. Because what I'm looking to do, and the reason why I use imagery is to create this optimal mind state for whatever that is for that individual when they're doing the imagery, and then taking that onto the competitive environment. And that's why I focus more on feeling. And also, as well as some days they might want to work on a higher high ball, for example, which takes longer to imagine, or they might want to work on different things. And these are things we'll speak about before doing the imagery training and using the imagery scripts. But that's how that's how I've seen more beneficial.
That's a good takeout from today. We've covered a lot. Definition of mental imagery and associated benefits, the science behind it, especially the 2 theories you double-clicked on, external or internal perspective and imagery ability. We've spoken about kinesthetic mental imagery and aphantasia, PETTLEP, and using scripts on that as well. And the big thing on scripts and the reps and sets of the timing is to go more on feelings rather than just ticking the box. And before I go to the final part and talking about you crazy mofo doing jiu-jitsu in your mid-40s and still banging out and using mental skills, is there anything we've missed in imagery? Is there anything else you think our listener, or practitioners especially, who are teaching this, or coaches who want to put this into practice, or, where I've seen a lot of utility in this, and I love the crossover between working in elite sport to the corporate work I do. I'm doing quite a lot of this. There's a group in defence, and I won't mention it specifically, they're Air Force, they're at the pointy end, and we've done some really good work on imagery, on them perceiving the environments they're going into. And I've had a few of them play back when they've gone to these environments that they cope much better. It's almost like that player, man, I feel like I've done it 1,000 times. So I see a real utility, not just for sport and what we're talking about, but for high performers of all levels. But is there anything else you would cover, or we need to cover, before we can talk about you and your martial arts?
No, I think that's really good. And just this thing you mentioned there, this crossover. I've worked with, young academy players who are, professional football clubs. And one thing they'll always say, oh yeah, I'm actually using this in my school or working with people. Or I think once you become proficient at imagery, you will then automatically, or you'll consciously use it in other situations which you may be struggling with or worried about, and then you will benefit you across all that, and across all. I see it across all performance domains, giving talks, presentations, not just sport. It's just any demanding environment. I think it can really work.
I absolutely use it for presentations. A couple of times a year now, I'll do presentations in America, big stages, thousands and thousands of people. First one I did, good Aussie term, I literally shit myself. I was like, I just got so nervous, and I just had to literally go into the toilet half an hour before I went on stage and go, I've got to calm down. I was off the charts, like anxious, nervous, and then I just had to use some of these skills. So absolutely, it has utility across other parts. Whenever you're stepping into a domain where you're putting yourself under pressure, and especially when you're stretching yourself, this has great utility, which is a beautiful segue. Jiu Jitsu, talk to me about that, because I can imagine you've got this person 10, 15 years younger, because it's not based on ages, is it? It's based on skill level.
So when you compete now, when you're competing, you can compete at age and belt level and weight level as well. So it's actually really good. So that's the competition side. It's the training side that's probably a lot harder, where you're training with, and they call it rolling, sparring with, 25-year-olds who are 10 kilograms heavier than you.
And also, I imagine 25 and they hear, I'm sparring this guy who is a world leader. He wrote the manual in sports psychology. They'd be like, I'm gonna take this bro down. Seriously, that's extra motivation.
No one at my club knows about that. I keep that side fairly quiet. To be honest, none of them even really understand what I do.
Really?
They're not interested either. None of the coaches are either. I'm quite happy with that. But I think for them, it's that mindset is they just want to kill everyone they roll with. They want to beat everyone they roll with, and they roll at 120%, which you can't. At my age, you can't. You can't do. You've got a limited time frame in which you can give your best. Sometimes that's actually gone during the warm up now, but I really enjoy it for my own mental health, and I think it's the best thing I've ever done, because I can't be thinking about anything else when I'm in that gym.
So did you do it for psychological detachment, or did you do it to put the skills into practice, or is it just a whole different reason?
Why did it? I had a bit of an incident when I was I started when I was 38, so 7 years ago, and there's just an incident where I got into a bit of trouble, and I'm with my family with me, and I thought, I can't really protect my family. This big dude who was, I don't know, it's something, we're on holiday, it's something to do with parking, and I was like, we had a bit of aggro, and I just thought I should really, I did judo when I was young, and I just thought, I'm a bit rusty with that. So I thought so I looked into what all the best martial arts are, and I looked at, Jocko Willink, and he is an advocate for Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. And
he's a beast, isn't he, Jocko?
He is, an absolute beast. And probably like a lot of people who do BJJ, it's probably because he's, talks about it. So I thought, right, I'm going to go and do it. I only thought I'd be doing it for 6 weeks just to learn a bit of self-defense, proper self-defense. And 7 years later, I'm still going. It's the best thing one of the best things I've ever done.
Love it. I can see the passion. Like, you're passionate about mental skills. You've gone to a whole different level doing jiu-jitsu.
Yeah. Because when I think about the benefits that it brings, I'm fitter now at 46, 45 than I was at 38. I'm more flexible. I've learned more about myself. So you go there, you learn, different takedowns, a double leg takedown, different chokes, blah, blah, blah. But you actually learn more about yourself than you do about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques. That's my opinion, anyway.
Do you think you've learned different things doing Jiu-Jitsu than you did by all the study and the academic work you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the main things I've learned is that that the sport's not the problem, I'm the problem. So, for example, what happened when I played tennis? Why I didn't, get to a high level? Why I didn't get to a high level in golf? Why I didn't get to a high level in other things I've done is not the sport, it's me. So it's me that needs to work. So it's taken me a good time to work that out. But yeah, and then also adapting some of the psychological stuff. So, you'll read an academic paper and you think, right, yeah, I'll try that. Well, actually, if I can make some adaptations to that, for me, that works better. It might not be the same case for other athletes, and then understanding, you read things like, yeah, I don't think that would work, or this will work, or the biggest thing I use as well. So I do the deep breathing, the imagery is when it's what in jiu-jitsu, before you compete, you go in what is known as the bullpen. So you've weighed in. They do take it quite seriously, even at masters level. So you weigh in. If you miss weight, you can't compete. And then you stand in this area, and you're not allowed to leave the area until you go out on the mat. Now, one time when I was in the bullpen, I was chatting to an ex-England rugby union player who played 5 times for England. I think he's the record club appearance holder for his, professional rugby. A very, very good player. And so I was like, yeah, I can't miss up to introduce myself. I had a good chat with him. And I was like, yeah, so how does this feel then compared to running out of Twickenham? We both stood in the bullpen. This is my first British Open, by the way. And he was like, yeah, this is worse. I'm like, what do you mean this is worse? It's probably 2,000 people here. No, but this is worse because I don't have my 14 other players to back me up. It's all on me. And I imagine as well, I didn't go into this, but, rugby is, is an elite performer. Jiu-Jitsu is not an elite performer. So I wonder whether that was in there. But yeah, he said it was worse. And I was feeling it as well, to be honest. And then that was my first British Open. And I was like, right, I really need to now start applying a bit more. So the next one, all right, I was like, I'd understood how I felt the first time. Right, now I'm going to create some challenge states. And what I'm going to do now sometimes you have 40 minutes to stand there. It's a metal, you're not allowed to leave this.
So what are you waiting for? Is it
for your match to start?
So there's a match already going and you're waiting for that to finish?
So for example, there might be like 8 mats. And this is at the British Open, 8 mats. And what happens is you're waiting and they'll then come and call you out. So that's when you leave the bullpen and walk to your designated mat. I just now thinking about it, I can feel the anxiety going now. And then you walk to your designated mat space with the other competitors. So you're all led out together. So what I wanted to do was create these challenge states. Because there is a threat of injury, probably not that high, but injuries do happen. There's a threat of, being humiliated, so being tapped out in 30 seconds. That's happened to me in maybe a minute or 2 minutes, which is embarrassing. But I had to teach myself that I couldn't focus on those things. I needed to focus on what I want to happen and how I'm going to make that happen, what my game plan is. And that's one thing that I've really felt beneficial.
I got a question and an observation. The question: did you win the British Open? Have you won a couple of titles?
No, I came second. So I've won a few matches there, but not quite the final. But yeah, and then the second time I came, I lost to the actual winner. But the really frustrating thing is both times I've had a really good opportunity. Really good. I'm not just saying that. I've had an opportunity where I've been in a very, very strong position and I let that go. But next time, that's not going to happen. I'm determined.
Again, it's a Carol Dweck, not yet. So, and here's the observation. You're living and breathing what you're teaching. And I've thought this as well. Every couple of years, I'll put myself through a challenge. I did a relay swim of the English Channel 4 years ago. A mate of mine that I've worked with, he was a mentor, got me into KPMG actually. He's had a bung shoulder. He's getting his shoulder fixed. We've been saying, let's do this Hawkesbury challenge. It's a sort of 15, 16 hour overnight paddle along a Hawkesbury river. We're going to do that next year. So I love every 4 or 5 years, I've got young kids like you as well. So you can't do it every year because I'll be single again. But I love putting yourself out there. So the observation is I can just see how passionate you are about doing it. I think it makes a much better practitioner. So do you teach this at university? So do you teach your students how you've got all the theory and the rigor and buy my book? Subtle plug for you, buddy.
So it's in the library. You can go get it for free.
No, you've got to sell it. It's a great book. But do you also then tell them, go and live this, do something, scare yourself, get that understanding between challenge and threat from a nervous system, from your brain going crazy on you, because it's so different feeling, as you said before about the reps and sets, than just reading or reciting.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there. Just, without being horrible, I do look at a lot of sports psychology practitioners, and I just think, when is the last time you probably ever challenged yourself? And I don't just mean like what we do. It could even be just, psychological challenge. And I do question when you hear them speak whether they've done anything that ever remotely resembles a challenge. Because like you say, I think it gives you a massive appreciation for the people that you're working with who are trying to do that on a weekly basis. We can't ever know what it's like for them in the NRL, but we can have a better understanding when we know what it's like to be absolutely hanging out your ass, got nothing left, but you still try it. And people can't do that. But in terms of my students, so I teach aspiring, they're on a sports coaching program, so they're already sports coaches. So I do talk about that and I encourage them to do what we're doing in our lectures, taking that onto the field or the court and then applying it, adapting it. That's one thing I always encourage them to do, to work, see what works for them, what doesn't work for them, and adapt it and find out. I do love a challenge. I challenge myself. Another good one that I do is, someone told me about this at work, it's the burpee challenge. So you do, first minute you do 1 burpee, second minute you do 2 burpees. So every minute you do an extra burpee, which sounds like, it sounds pretty easy. But once you get to 10, it's not easy at all. And my record is 14. And so I did 14 and, but it's like having these challenges. When I do HIIT training, I write down my reps in each exercise. I'm always looking to improve it. I like challenges. I think
we'll put that burpee challenge up on the show notes. We'll put a couple of posts.
Good.
We'll make reference to some of the research papers and articles. I'll make sure that we put your LinkedIn up there. Anyone listening to this, you've got to follow this guy. Your frequency of posting, is it daily or are you posting a couple of times?
It's daily. Might become a bit less frequent maybe in the future. But certainly a few times a week. And focusing on better content. Definitely.
I've really enjoyed today. I really have, and
me too.
I've enjoyed the dance between. It's not just imagery, but just seeing how you pull that together with other skills. But the bit you just went to a whole different level when we spoke about you doing this in Jiu Jitsu. You can watch this, so people can watch this as well on YouTube. And it's not that you weren't passionate before, but you just went up to a different intensity. And to me, the big learning from this, I've had some good takeouts, so I'm going to change what I do, so thank you. So I wanted to, my goal was twofold. One was to cover the information for people, because it's trendy at the moment, imagery, and I wanted to go to one of the world's leading experts, you. Secondary, I really wanted to run the filter on my practice, on what I've been doing with athletes. I'm going to change it from our conversation today. I'm going to make a few tweaks.
Oh, wow, that's amazing too. Amazing. It's amazing. Thank you. Thank you.
I'm looking at the time. You've got to go to work. I probably need to go to bed. We could talk for ages and ages. What's your final message for people who are wanting to put imagery or to put any mental skill into practice?
I think it's about experimenting with whatever you do, whatever mental imagery skill you use, finding out what works and then sticking to it and practicing it, because the more you stick to it and practice it, the more effective it will be when you really need it under a pressurized situation, whether that's giving a talk in America, playing in the NRL, playing at club golf on a Sunday morning. The more it's practiced, the more it'll benefit you when you need it.
tapping some guy out next time you're in the British Open and you've got a chance.
I'm not losing that chance next time.
I'll be following your LinkedIn post for an update. Mate, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's been great talking to you. It really has. Thank you.